Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a bit of a philosophical expedition.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We're not just talking about politics in the sense of, elections or budgets. We're diving into the intellectual bedrock that determines how we define justice itself.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal here is to really tackle a foundational question. What fundamentally makes oppression unjust? And we want to move far beyond the usual understanding of, who has what resources.
We're looking for what you could call the normative core, the really deep damage.
Exactly.
That's right. Our mission today is really focused on bridging social theory with ethics. We want to explore how structural injustice does more than just deprive you of a bigger bank account or access to a good school.
Things you can measure easily.
Right. The idea is that it actively inhibits human flourishing at the most foundational level. We're talking about the development of the self.
So we're shifting the focus from something external, like what you have,
to something internal, a constraint on who you are capable of becoming, who you are capable of being.
This conceptual shift is so critical, and it really owes a huge debt to thinkers like Iris Young.
Absolutely.
For decades, justice was defined almost exclusively through, a lens of distribution.
Yeah, fair shares.
Our resources is wealth, our opportunities allocated fairly. And Young came along and introduced this powerful idea that injustice is fundamentally structural, it's relational.
And it manifests not just as, unfair sharing, but as oppression and domination.
And that structural view is, I think it's fair to say, widely accepted now.
It is. But here's the intellectual gap we're really focusing on today.
Okay.
When people discuss Young's work now, they often get stuck arguing about responsibility.
Who's to blame? Who has to fix it?
Exactly. Who's responsible for fixing these unjust structures?
Yeah.
And in that debate, they frequently overlook or underanalyze the deep normative claim that Young herself prioritized, which the centrality of self-development.
Yeah.
That this is the ultimate target of oppression's harm. People just sort of assume we know what self-development is and why it matters, but the actual mechanism is left really vague.
So we have this influential framework, structural injustice, but we lack a clear, a detailed sociological and psychological explanation for how it gets inside you, how it harms the self.
That is the intellectual framework we're constructing today, piece by piece. We're connecting rigorous social structure theory, drawing on figures like Sally Haslanger and Pierre Bourdieu, with a clear, robust theory of self-development and well-being.
So we can understand not just that oppression is bad, but the precise way it works.
The precise sociological mechanism by which that inhibition occurs, often from the inside, by constraining your own thoughts, your desires, and even your bodily movements.
And if you, the listener, feel that certain structural issues are just so pervasive and persistent, it's because, as these sources argue, they are written into the very fabric of our being, not just the laws on the books. So the big question that's going to guide us through this entire deep dive is this. What if oppression fundamentally limits not just what you possess, but the very horizon of possibility you can imagine and pursue?
That's the question.
Let's start then by grounding ourselves in Iris Young's essential philosophical shift, moving away from that purely distributive model of justice.
Okay.
So traditional justice is asking, are the resources allocated fairly? Young says no, that's not the primary question. She says justice is concerned with two core general values, and both are centered on human capacity and relations.
That's right.
So what are those dual values, and how did she define the injustices that correspond to them?
So Young identified two fundamental values that really speak to human freedom and capacity. The first one is participation.
Participation.
Which she linked to self-determination. This is the capacity to, determine the conditions of your own action.
To have a say.
To have a say. And if you are systematically denied a voice, or if you're subject to the arbitrary will of others, a boss, a landlord, a government, you are suffering from what she called domination.
Domination. Okay, so that's the systematic denial of self-determination.
Exactly.
That sounds like a very direct harm. Political, institutional.
It is, and it's critical. But the second value is where our focus is today, and that is the development and exercise of human capacities.
Which we're calling self-development.
Right, for shorthand.
Yeah.
And the systematic denial of this, the ability to grow, to learn satisfying skills, to express yourself, and to use your body and your mind effectively, that is what Young defined as oppression.
So if domination is about being ruled, oppression is about being stunted.
That's a great way to put it.
And the distinction is crucial because Young argued that Inequalities of wealth and power are unjust only to the extent that they inhibit these two fundamental values.
Exactly. It completely reprioritizes the harm. Oppression specifically attacks the flourishing human self through these systemic, seemingly impersonal social processes.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about a person who is prevented from pursuing an education, not by a direct law saying you can't go to school, but because the expectations, the norms, the economic necessities of their social position
make that path fundamentally unavailable or just seem irrational.
Right. The system doesn't just take their potential wealth, it prevents them from becoming an educated professional. That is the deep harm of oppression.
But this brings us right back to that problem we mentioned, the recognized problem in philosophy. The term self-development can feel, well, really vague, especially when we try to define it without falling back on old essentialist ideas. The notion that everyone has some fixed innate potential they have to realize.
Right, like a seed that has to become a specific flower.
And Jung tried to avoid this. She interpreted self-development through the lens of Amartya Sen's equality as capabilities.
And Sen's capabilities approach, it focuses on providing the freedom, the capabilities, for people to achieve various functionings.
Functionings like what?
Like being well-nourished, being educated, participating in political life. And Sen, he intentionally kept the list of valued functionings procedural. It was open-ended.
He didn't want to prescribe what a good life is.
Exactly. He wanted to leave that choice up to individuals and communities.
But the moment you leave something open-ended like that, you open yourself up to criticism for being too vague.
Precisely. And Martha Nussbaum, who's another major capability theorist, famously critiqued Sen on exactly this point.
What was her argument?
She argued that just having the freedom to choose to be well-nourished isn't enough. We need to specify concrete components of well-being that are derived from a foundational value, like human dignity.
So she wanted a fixed list.
A fixed list of basic capabilities that everyone is entitled to, regardless of, local preference.
So Nussbaum provided the specificity that Sen avoided, but our sources suggest that even her focus kind of missed the mark when it comes to structural injustice.
That's right. Nussbaum was primarily focused on addressing what she called basic capability deprivations. Ensuring people meet a baseline level of flourishing in things like health and bodily integrity.
So having the basic components for a decent life.
Yes. But she was less preoccupied with the deep harm of structural oppression itself. That systemic self-reproducing process that constrains the flourishing of entire groups well above the basic survival threshold.
Hey, that structural harm is much more subtle. It's the constant systematic pressure, not just the acute lack of a basic need.
Absolutely. And this vagueness leads to the philosophical problem that really weakens a lot of arguments against structural injustice.
How so?
Well, philosophers correctly anchor their moral condemnation in these powerful generalized concepts like flourishing or well-being.
Okay.
So we see arguments, for example, that what makes sweatshops structurally unjust is that workers are prevented from developing their unique capacity for self-development. That's Maeve McKeown. Or Catherine Liu, who describes structural injustice as a threat to human flourishing that leads to existential alienation.
And we feel the moral truth in those statements. We know instinctively that systematic poverty or gender barriers stifle human potential.
Of course.
But the mechanism is still too abstract. If I were playing devil's advocate, I could just say, well, what exactly is this self that is being inhibited? And prove to me the structure is doing the inhibiting and not just say poor individual choices.
And that's the challenge. The philosophical work that's missing is a detailed structural explanation of the inhibition mechanism.
We need the how.
We need the how. We need a theory that can define self-development in a non-essentialist way, explain why it's a valuable good for the person, and then show precisely how the social structure infiltrates and inscribes constraints onto the individual.
Making the self-development process nearly impossible for certain groups.
Yeah, exactly. Without this unified, detailed framework, the normative force of the claim that oppression inhibits self-development, well, it remains weakened. It's confined to moral intuition rather than rigorous proof.
Okay, so if the injustice is structural and we need a detailed mechanism, we first need to get laser focused on what a structure actually is. We have to move beyond the simple idea of just society's rules.
Right. To understand the harm of oppression, we have to adopt a really rigorous, mechanistic, and sociological definition of social structure.
And we're moving beyond individual actions or even single institutions here.
We're thinking about coordinated systems of practice, and we're drawing heavily from thinkers like Haslanger and Bourdieu.
So let's unpack the definition. A social structure is not a static object. It's an abstract set of positions and a corresponding pattern of coordinated, interdependent practices. What does that abstract set of positions mean in practice?
It means that structures define roles and the relations between those roles. Parent and child, student and teacher, worker and manager, citizen and non-citizen.
So the positions exist as concepts, even if no one's in them at the moment.
Right. The structure gives these positions meaning and power relationships. And the pattern of practices is everything that constitutes those relationships. The formal laws, the informal norms, the habitual responses, the roles, the hierarchies, all of it.
So a social structure exists before we're born, but we keep creating it every single day through our actions.
Exactly. Structures precede subjects.
Yeah.
You were born into a pre-existing structure defined by categories like race, class, and gender. But they are fundamentally processes, not static states.
Okay.
They're created and recreated through every single interaction we have. And this leads to this crucial idea of the duality of structures.
Let's delve into that. The duality of structures. That sounds like a powerful way of explaining why change is so difficult.
It really is. The duality states that structures are simultaneously the medium and the outcome of the practices.
The medium and the outcome. Unpack that.
Okay, so structures provide the context, the rules, and the resources that shape our practices. That's the medium. But our practices, our actions, our adherence to norms, our routines, they continually constitute and reproduce those very structures. That's the outcome.
Can you give us an analogy?
Think of language. The rules of a language shape how you speak, right? That's the medium. But every time you speak, you are reproducing and even slightly modifying those language rules for the next generation. That's the outcome.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
A generative cycle.
Exactly. That makes perfect sense. If we stop speaking the language, the structure disappears. But while we speak it, it defines our possibilities. So what are the actual building blocks, the components of this self-reproducing structural mechanism?
So Sally Haslanger identifies two essential interdependent elements: resources and schemata.
Resources and schemata.
Let's start with resources. These are anything that confers power in social relations. So this includes the obvious material goods like capital and land, but also intangible goods.
Like what?
Like specialized skills, knowledge, social networks, the ability to mobilize large groups of people. All of those are resources.
And the schemata. This is where the internalization part starts to come in, right?
Yes. Schemata are the intersubjective patterns of thought and perception.
Intersubjective meaning shared between people.
Shared between people. They're the culturally shared norms, attitudes, beliefs, and dispositions. Think of them as the cognitive and emotional scripts that guide our social interaction.
So a belief like men are naturally better leaders would be a schema.
A perfect example. It's public, it's shared, and it becomes embodied in individuals as a habitual way of thinking and acting.
So the structure needs both parts to function. It needs the resource, like the CEO's salary, and the schema, the shared belief that a CEO should look and act a certain way.
Precisely. They are fundamentally interdependent. Schemata are validated and sustained by the accumulation of resources. If the schema that education is the path to power is broadly shared,
then resources flow towards universities and research.
Exactly. And conversely, resources require schemata to direct them. Without this shared belief, the schema, that a certain skill, let's say software coding, is valuable, then the capital invests in that skill and the people who have it.
That resource loses its social power.
It dissipates. The interdependence is what gives the structure its deep persistence over time.
Okay, let's move from the abstract structure to how it classifies people. How are structural social groups defined?
A structural social group is defined by people who share a similar position within that dense web of relations.
And that position conditions their possibilities for action.
Right. And crucially, these groups are relationally constituted. A group's existence isn't just defined by shared attributes, like having the same skin color.
It's defined by its relationship to other groups.
Yes, which systematically differentiates them by power, by opportunities, by vulnerability. Your social position dictates the probability of your access to resources, to education, to occupation.
This is starting to sound a bit like destiny, but we need to understand why these structural facts feel like objective reality to us. And Bourdieu introduced this idea of objectivity in social structures in two distinct senses.
The first sense is the material dimension, the objective distribution of socially scarce goods or capital.
That's easy to see. Who owns the land? Who controls the factories?
Right. But the second sense is the symbolic or cognitive dimension, the systems of classification. These are the mental and bodily schemata that function as symbolic templates for activity, for thought, for judgment.
So the structure objectively dictates not just how much capital you have, but also the very categories you use to classify yourself and others.
Yes. The symbolic order is inseparable from the social group structure. If a society objectively classifies one group as lazy, that's a schema, and another as industrious, another schema, this symbolic classification precedes and conditions the agency of both groups.
And this is what creates the powerful looping effect. Can you give us a detailed example of this feedback loop?
The looping effect is when structural relations become physically or materially inscribed in the environment.
Written into the world.
Yes. Think about gendered norms. The schema of two rigid sex categories is actualized in the environment, in gendered toys, clothing, professional roles, even the design of public space.
And that material reality then reinforces the mental schema.
In our children and in ourselves, which in turn perpetuates the associated social practices and labeling. Haslanger's example of race is really powerful here.
How does that work?
The classification of race reinforces segregation, which reinforces racial identity, which in turn reinforces the initial classification.
It becomes an infinite, mutually sustaining loop.
It does. And the most insidious part is that this loop creates the illusion of naturalness.
We believe our responses, our preferences, our choices are just called for by the world itself.
Without ever realizing the deep historical shaping that occurred. We are blind to the structural scripting. We feel like we're making a natural choice, say, choosing a certain career path that aligns with our gender, when in fact, the entire field of possibilities, the menu of rational choices, was structurally predefined and restricted long before we ever made the decision.
And that's why structural injustice is so powerful. It hides in plain sight. It masquerades as objective reality or just personal inclination. But if structure is so powerful, doesn't this run into the charge of determinism? The idea that individuals have no free will? We need to address that head on.
Absolutely. The structural view holds that phenomena are properly understood by considering how individual actions and choices interact with the objective social environment, but it does not claim full determination.
So we have to invoke Marx here.
We have to. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. Structural conditions do not force practices. They affect the probability of practices emerging.
How does that look practically? How does it affect probability?
Structures act as massive incentive systems. They make certain actions dramatically easier, like succeeding if you attend a prestigious university.
And they make other actions significantly riskier.
Right. Like starting a small business without capital in a structurally impoverished area. They make certain actions seem irrational or socially unacceptable. So structures incentivize, but they do not fully determine behavior.
Individual agency is always the final ingredient.
Always. But it's agency operating within a heavily pressurized, pre-structured environment.
Okay, to make this point even sharper, let's go back to the definition of structure and critique, an analogy that's often used by other philosophers, like Wolff and Duchalet.
The rules of the game analogy.
Right. They proposed a framework where your opportunities are determined by your internal resources, like talents, your external resources, like income, and then the social structure or the rules that affect how those resources get used.
And that framework is just too simplistic. It separates elements that are, by our structural definition, deeply integrated. It treats structure as the passive rules that govern how we play the game. But the structure is the game itself.
So it's not just the rules, it is the game.
Yes. When you change the structure, say, by suddenly defining community engagement as highly socially valuable and rewarded, you are changing the definition of what counts as a resource in the first place.
That's a crucial distinction. It's not just changing the rules of soccer to allow more scoring. It's changing the game entirely, maybe switching from soccer to water polo.
Precisely. The structure defines what capital is, how it's valued, and which groups are positioned to accumulate it. It conditions how agents even think about and use capital.
So if a rule changes, persists.
Because the resources and the schemata remain mutually supportive. And this comprehensive definition structure as a mutually reinforcing system of practices, norms, and relational positions that systematically disempower specific groups shows that oppression operates independent of individual malice or intent.
Okay, so structural oppression is this powerful system. Now, having established what structural oppression is and how it operates via resources and schemata, we have to return to the normative question. What exactly is the fundamental harm? And this requires us to define self-development rigorously, escaping that vagueness we talked about earlier.
Right. To define the normative anchor, what an unoppressed life looks like, we have to be really careful to avoid the risk of essentialism.
The idea of a fixed, innate self.
Exactly. If we say self-realization means realizing a fixed set of talents, we're ignoring the fact that the self is fundamentally socially constituted, which we just established. The self we become is historical and relational.
So we need a definition that allows for a dynamic, socially engaged self. And this is a processual view of self-development, often associated with Dewey, Gould, and Jaeggi.
Yes.
What is the fundamental shift this view makes?
The shift is that you don't realize a fixed self. Instead, and this is a key phrase, one realizes oneself in what one does.
So the self is dynamic. It's continually constructed and materialized through activity and interaction.
It's about the quality and the structure of the life being lived, not the fulfillment of some pre-existing blueprint.
Let's break this processual view of self-development down into its key components.
Okay, first, it absolutely requires self-determination, the ability to set one's own projects and goals. This is the precondition of non-domination.
If your life goals are dictated by external forces, then any activity that follows isn't really self-development.
It can't be.
Yeah.
Second, it is fundamentally a way of being active. It's not passive introspection.
Right.
It is active interaction with the world and its appropriation, mediated by the development and exercise of our vast range of human capacities: intellectual, physical, emotional, social.
The third component addresses motivation, and this seems really important for distinguishing it from, say, forced labor or purely instrumental activities.
Yes. The activity must be non-instrumental, meaning it's done for its own sake, or at least it's appreciated for the process itself.
So if I learn astrophysics just because it promises the highest salary?
That learning is instrumental. But if you learn astrophysics because you find the process of discovery, the mastery of complex mathematical tools, and understanding the universe inherently satisfying.
That is self-development.
Exactly. Of course, most activities are both instrumental and non-instrumental, but the processual view emphasizes the internal satisfaction of developing a capacity.
And the fourth component captures the ongoing nature of flourishing.
Right. It is a continuous activity with a historical dimension. It characterizes a certain mode of living.
A life defined by transformation, engagement, and challenge.
Yes. Rather than a static, achieved end state. If you achieve a goal and then you just stop, the self-development stops. The value is in the structure of the life, which is continuously open to growth.
That provides a really robust, dynamic definition. But to make it our normative anchor for justice, we need to prove why this continuous process of capacity development is a prudential value, why it's inherently good for the person who has it. We need to defend this against other theories of well-being, like hedonism or simple preference satisfaction.
And for that, we turn to Richard Kraut's developmental theory of well-being, or developmentalism. Kraut provides a powerful defense for why capacity development is the organizing principle of a good life.
So how does he build this argument systematically?
Step 1. Value is relational. Kraut insists something is only good for someone. Good poetry is good for the reader and the writer. Good food is good for the person eating it.
So goodness is always defined by its suitability to the subject.
Right. This immediately rejects the idea of some universal, abstract good just floating out there.
Okay.
Step 2. The standard of goodness must be flourishing. For all living things, a human, a tree, and animal, flourishing is what is intrinsically good for them. What's good for a tree is sunlight and water, because those things allow it to flourish as a tree.
And step 3 translates that concept of flourishing to humans and synthesizes it with our processual view of the self.
Yes. Human flourishing is defined as the process of development and exercise of capacities that best suits things of the human kind. Since humans have these complex intellectual, social, moral, emotional capacities, a flourishing human life must be one characterized by the continuous development and exercise of those capacities.
But why is this better than simply maximizing pleasure, which is what hedonism aims for, or simply getting what you want, which is what desire satisfaction is all about?
Kraut argues that the idea of capacities plays an organizing role in systematizing our thoughts about what is good.
An organizing role.
Yes. If we look at activities we universally recognize as constituting a good, lifelike, deep, reciprocal relationships, or critical engagement with complex ideas, or committing to challenging long-term goals, we realize they're good not because they maximize immediate pleasure.
In fact, they often involve struggle and pain.
They do. And they're not good simply because we desire them. They are good because they inherently involve the continuous development and exercise of our most complex human capacities.
So, if a person derived great pleasure from doing nothing but staring at a wall, or if they successfully achieved their lifelong desire to collect bottle caps.
Kraut would argue that while those activities might satisfy pleasure or desire, they are deficient in prudential value.
Because they fail to engage and develop the complex capacities that are characteristic of human flourishing.
That's the core defense. Developmentalism arrives at the value of capacity development by observing concrete human experience and finding that this is the best explanation for the goodness of these highly valued human activities.
So a flourishing life is defined by the structure of continuous activity, challenge, and engagement, regardless of the specific functionings you achieve.
Precisely. And this developmental view gives us the necessary, non-essentialist, and robust normative framework to finally analyze the deep harm of structural injustice.
Now we have all the pieces. We have the mechanism of structure from part 2 and the value being suppressed from part 3. We have to synthesize these elements to understand the concept of developmental enclosure.
And we need the bridge between the external structure and the internal self. Before we define the concept, it's worth noting that philosophers of oppression have long used these spatial metaphors to describe the psychological harm.
What do you mean spatial metaphors?
Well, thinkers like Marion, Ann Cudd, and Sandra Bartke. They described oppression as something that confines and immobilizes.
Creating an enclosing structure of forces and barriers.
Right. Condemning the individual to immanence of mere bodily being.
They describe the feeling of being caged or restricted. So we need a structural explanation for how social structures create this constrained subjectivity, this constrained body.
And the crucial sociological concept that provides that explanation is Bourdieu's habitus. Habitus is the mechanism that translates external structural necessity into internal disposition.
Define habitus for us in detail.
Okay, so habitus is, first, a system of embodied and mental dispositions. These are schemas of perception, patterns of thinking, feeling, classification.
Things that are so deeply ingrained, they allow us to navigate the social world without constant conscious deliberation.
Right. It's like a deeply programmed subconscious script for social interaction. And the second key definition.
It is the unconscious internalization of objective social structures.
Yes. Habitus is shared among people with similar structural positions, people who grew up with similar access to resources, opportunities, shared norms. Through habitus, the objective structural relations and historical necessities become physically and mentally deposited in individuals as mental and corporeal schemata.
So if a structure dictates that a certain path is impossible, the habitus internalizes that impossibility as a natural inclination or a reluctance or just a lack of interest.
Exactly. The structure dictates the probabilities and the habitus internalizes those probabilities as natural inclination or necessity. And this allows agents to reproduce structures even when they feel like they're acting spontaneously or exercising their free will.
The oppressed person may feel they're choosing to stay small.
Right. And in fact, the habitus has trained their very body and mind to occupy limited space.
Let's explore the manifestations of this enclosed habitus, starting with the body. The classic, vivid example is Jung's phenomenology of feminine body comportment within patriarchy.
Jung observed that structural norms governing women's behavior often lead to a constrained or hesitant mode of moving the body.
For instance, in sports or public settings.
Right. The woman may experience her body as a static object, something to be defended or contained, rather than a powerful means of open transcendence or action.
Can you describe that feeling of constraint more dynamically?
Well, think about the difference between a man and a woman in a casual game of catch, according to this observation. A man is structurally trained to aggressively move out and seize the space necessary to catch the ball, seeing the ball as a target to be mastered.
Okay.
A woman whose body comportment is constrained by structural norms of propriety and vulnerability might tend to remain in one place, contracting herself or responding to the approaching ball as something to avoid or protect herself from.
Ducking instead of extending.
Right. And this isn't a conscious choice of non-participation. It's a deep-seated, embodied response, a learned way of occupying space.
And the result is a profound feeling of incapacity and objectification. The lived body is experienced as rooted and enclosed, limited spatially and energetically.
Now, moving from the body to the mind, structural domination based on class or race exerts a formative influence that leads to the internalization of resignation. This is the hidden injury of class described by Sennett and Cobb.
What are these hidden injuries?
They are the subtle psychological wounds inflicted by class structures. The working class man internalizes the belief that despite his hard work, he is fundamentally less capable or less deserving than those in privileged positions.
And this leads to profound self-doubt and resignation,
causing him to limit his aspirations to match the limitations set by the system. Meanwhile, the privileged group internalizes an unjustified sense of entitlement and effortless superiority.
Both are distorted, enclosed dispositions set by the system of stratification.
And both work to reinforce the stability of that system.
And when structural categorization, like racialization, links material conditions and social position to one's idea of the self, the harm becomes profound.
It forces a group's subjectivity toward resignation, linking their social position with the very horizon of possible well-being. Frantz Fanon, in his work on colonial and racist societies, documented how the brutal logic of categorization forces individuals into these essentialized identities.
So identity ceases to be something freely constructed.
And becomes instead a reflection of constraints, prohibitions, and denials. The constraints are so structurally deposited that they shape a person by what they are structurally trained not only to suppress, but never to imagine.
This leads us directly to the ultimate harm, developmental enclosure.
Developmental enclosure occurs when one's enclosed habitus, the dispositions, the mental schemata, the bodily comportment formed in oppressive conditions, leads directly and systematically to the inhibition of self-development.
The continuous free exercise and development of capacities required for a flourishing life, as we defined it with Kraut.
Exactly. Oppression works not just externally through policy or deprivation, but deeply from the inside, by constraining the body, mind, and imagination before any conscious choice is even made.
This concept seems essential for tackling that thorny philosophical issue of the paradox of the happy slave.
It is.
If oppression works internally, how do we evaluate a person who claims to be happy despite being in a structurally constrained position?
This is where understanding internalized oppression via habitus is absolutely crucial. People are psychologically compelled to construct meaningful lives within the conditions they find. They adapt their preferences to the available options to maintain psychological stability.
So the structurally imposed enclosing dispositions can intertwine perfectly with the satisfaction of these constrained, adapted preferences.
They can.
Can you give us a concrete example of that kind of preference adaptation?
Sure. Imagine a working-class young person who internalizes this schema that advanced education is not for people like us. Maybe due to years of observing systemic disadvantages and failures in the public school system. They adapt by developing a preference for immediate entry into a low-skilled job. And they find happiness and satisfaction in the predictable security and camaraderie of that life. They are maximizing their subjective happiness and their preference satisfaction.
But they are doing so at the cost of self-development.
Exactly. Their very conception of the good life is itself set by the constraints of the structure. They may feel subjectively happy, but from a developmental perspective, they have suffered a profound loss of opportunities to exercise and grow their intellectual, their critical, their social capacities.
The structure has succeeded in reproducing itself by shaping the individual's internal measuring stick for success.
Right. The harm is the loss of the possibility of all-around flourishing, which their enclosed habitus prevents them from even recognizing as a loss.
So developmental enclosure creates a condition where one is not only unable to develop and flourish, but also psychologically resistant to the very opportunities that would allow them to do so. What are some other tangible behavioral manifestations of this enclosure?
We see it manifesting first in alienation. This is a deficient relation to oneself that stems from the absence of the possibility of actively appropriating the world.
Resulting in a profound loss of hope.
A loss of hope in realizing one's human capacities and an acceptance of current conditions as inevitable or natural. The world feels opaque and unresponsive to one's efforts.
There are also specific survival adaptations in conditions of poverty that exemplify this constraint.
Absolutely. Think about the learned disposition towards the maximization of immediate hedonistic pleasures, rather than long-term planning or investment in self-development.
And this isn't a moral failure.
Not at all. It is a rational adaptation. When structural poverty makes the future inherently uncertain and the returns on long-term investment, like saving for college, are unreliable or minimal due to systemic barriers.
It is rational to maximize immediate pleasures.
But this adaptation inhibits the continuous capacity development that Kraut identified as key to flourishing.
We also see the internalization of external experiences into deep social rejection.
Yes. The rejection of civic engagement is common among groups who have experienced unjust treatment by democratic processes. Why bother voting or participating if the system is rigged against you?
Right.
Similarly, a profound disdain for education often arises from cumulative experiences of unfairness and perceived futility in educational opportunities. The message the structure sends is internalized. This game isn't for you.
And finally, that powerful spatial constraint we discussed earlier, the desire to hide in public spaces.
This is a classic demonstration of enclosed habitus made manifest. The feeling of shame, the reluctance of a working-class kid in a middle-class school cafeteria to seek help, or the poor man's desire to be invisible in a crowded marketplace.
The mental schema dictates, you do not belong here, minimize your presence.
Exactly. And this constraint, deposited in the body and mind, reinforces an inability to fully engage, speak, and develop capacities in public settings.
The profound implication here is that this form of structural injustice is incredibly difficult to detect and combat because the structures are formative and self-reproducing through the agents themselves.
The harm is profound, precisely because it targets the very process of living a good life. It demands that we move beyond simple material redistribution and adopt this radical humanistic vision of flourishing, the continuous process of self-development, to truly understand the extent of the injustice perpetrated by systemic oppression.
So we've really established a deep framework today.
I think so. Structural injustice is not merely about resource deprivation, it's about developmental enclosure.
This systematic, often invisible process where external constraints, norms, practices, resource distribution are internalized into one's habitus.
And this constrained disposition fundamentally limits one's body, one's imagination, and one's perception of possibility.
Thereby inhibiting the continuous process of self-development required for a truly flourishing life.
We have to look at the structure of a life lived, rather than just the material possessions accumulated.
And for you, the learner, understanding that these constraints are built into the very fabric of reality, the institutions, the norms, the resources, and then internalized by our own dispositions, helps us critically analyze social problems at their root. It forces us to acknowledge that inequality is not just a failure of policy, but a systemic failure of our ability to allow others to become who they are capable of being, defining the boundaries of their lives through internalized necessity.
And if we accept that capacity development is the organizing principle of the good life, and that our habitus, our body and mind, is fundamentally shaped by the structural positions we occupy, then solutions require more than superficial changes.
Right.
We have to dismantle the very structures that train people not only to expect less, but to desire less, thereby constraining possibility from the inside.
So we leave you with this provocative closing thought, something for you to mull over in your own life and interactions. If our own thoughts, our preferences, and even our most spontaneous bodily movements are shaped by structural forces and internalized necessity, our enclosed habitus, how do we identify the boundary between genuine self-determination and the confines of that habitus? And how, structurally, does one create the conditions necessary for a person to begin to exercise capacities that they have been systematically trained not only to suppress, but perhaps never even to imagine in the first place?